on full screen. Look at that. Okay, well, welcome to Virtual America's Impressionism. And I want to thank Lindley and Kevin and everybody at the Dixon for not only putting on this program, but putting on the exhibition and bringing it to its first venue. It's been a long time coming, as many of us know. So much has been delayed and changed that we are really thrilled to be able to get the exhibition in this really complete form into the galleries at the Dixon. So as I promised for my talk today, I'm going to be looking at what I call a perfect or the perfect storm of elements that came together to be the preconditions for American Impressionism. What we look at in the exhibition is how popular the style is, how it spreads across the country, how it lasts for decades and decades and decades. And, you know, it made me as an art historian think, how did that come to be? What was it that made the moment just right for American Impressionism to take root and hold on for as long as it did? And so today I'm going to talk about 4 elements of this perfect storm. And I realized, I don't know if this is meaningful, but it's like the grammar of American Impressionism, because I'm going to be talking about the person, the place, the thing, and the idea that were important to the formation of American Impressionism. So not necessarily in this order, but the person is Monet, the place is the American landscape, the thing is foreign training, and the idea is sentimentality. So those are the 4 things we're going to investigate today, using a lot of examples from the exhibition, then a few things that I wished could be in the exhibition, and it'll inform, I think, your visit to the galleries the next time you're able. So I want to talk about the American landscape first. Landscape painting in the United States is something that had already, by the time of the American Impressionist movement, become kind of synonymous with American art. The plein air landscape style. So by plein air, I mean painting outdoors in front of the motif, right in the landscape, painting exactly what you see in real time. That plein air landscape impulse in Impressionism fit right in with what Americans were already doing in terms of a national painting style. So landscape had become very strong in the American painting tradition, and it's sort of what it was known for internationally, if one could say that American art had an international reputation in the pre-Civil War era. But let me fast forward for a second to 1886, and this is a year I'll refer to a lot. It's the year of the first major American or major Impressionist exhibition. That is an exhibition of French Impressionism in the United States, in New York in 1886. And the reviews for that show came out very badly. One of my favorite quotes, though, one of the most telling, is a critic that said that the exhibition presented unholy figural work. And to me, I think of, there's a certain Renoir ballet dancer that was in that, and I think that's what he was thinking of. But then they go on to describe the landscapes of the Impressionists from France appearing in the United States as lovely, heavenly, and tender. So we already get the sense that American audiences, or at least the critics, were much more willing to admit this new style if it was in the format of landscape painting. So let me do the world's quickest landscape history in the United States. Pre-Civil War, American art landscapes or American landscape painting really had the drive of being exacting and realistic. We'd often talk about the Hudson River School of painters, looking for not just an American subject matter, a recognizable place, but an American style being sharp and clear and distinct. And often underlying these paintings were deeper meanings, political meanings, religious meanings, personal and poetic meanings. So the landscape was already a very flexible format in the United States. So I'm showing you Thomas Cole, one of the leaders of the pre-Civil War American landscape school. And then I'm going to jump to the post-Civil War. And maybe this isn't Albert Bierstadt's most famous painting, but gosh, the Rinaldi House has a real gem here in their Sierra Nevadas of 1871 to 1873. Artists like Bierstadt, coming from other countries, coming from Germany, in fact, were in the United States painting this grandiose landscape, this super awe-inspiring, awesome landscape, which was something other places didn't necessarily offer. It was the novelty of this American landscape, especially to European painters or European audiences, that was really remarkable. So when painters from the US were showing their work in international exhibitions, I always go to the World's Fair of 1867. It's in the landscape that American identity was starting to be located. People from France, from England, were recognizing the American school of landscape painting. Now, let me jump to a different landscape painter here. This is a little painting, little panel, and I had the privilege of exhibiting it at the Brandywine for several months. So I got to go and look at it every day. It was already one of my favorites, but being able to see Winslow Homer's artist sketching in the White Mountains adds a new level to the story of a landscape painting. It reminds us about plein air painting. The French did not invent it. Other people were doing plein air landscape painting, painting out in the open. As Homer shows us here, this set of artists capturing the view in the White Mountains, one after the other, each one taking their turn, trying to capture the moment and the essence of that landscape. So Homer is already a gateway into our era of impressionist paintings. No one would jump on and say, oh, Winslow Homer, he's definitely an American Impressionist, but he is part of the pathway, and his popularity in the period didn't hurt American Impressionist painters who were also doing plein air landscape painting. So you have to remember that in the United States, landscape painting was very well accepted and expected. But in France, the plein air style of landscape painting was kind of renegade. It was against what was being taught at the École des Beaux-Arts and the state school. So let's look for a minute at the renegade aspect of the French modern landscape movement, because it adds a little flavor. When American artists are going abroad, this style is kind of appealing, and very appealing to collectors as well in the United States. I'm showing you here Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, who is a leader of the Barbizon school. So a different French landscape school, still modern, but pre-shadowing or foreshadowing the Impressionist movement. 1846 is the date of this painting. The men that worked around Corot worked around the forest of Fontainebleau. So the example I'm showing you is that. He was an academic painter, but he wasn't terribly successful at the salon. So in his summer times and his time off, he would make these loose little landscape paintings. And they started to become more popular than his academic salon paintings, especially popular in the United States. Go figure. As a matter of fact, American collectors were intently interested in this renegade landscape style. And you can kind of see they might be more interested in landscapes from other countries. So this modern landscape style has led to a huge passion for Corot in the United States, especially in Boston. And there's a quote I make in the catalog. Ross King also cites it. It's sort of art world gossip that says, this is just to show you how popular Corot was in the period. Corot painted 2,000 canvases, 5,000 of which are in the United States. And also that there are more fake Corots in Boston than there are real Corots in the rest of the world. That's how popular Corot was in Boston, that they were buying anything that looked like Corot or purported to be a Corot. And I can sort of point out how important Corot was to the Impressionist movement in France, sort of by Well, that very first review of the 1874 First Impressionist exhibition in Paris, and I'll quote from it later, but there was a really funny review of it. And the reviewer, Louis Leroy, is lamenting what's going on in French painting. And he says, "Oh, Corot, Corot, what crimes are committed in your name?" So we know Corot is part of this movement towards Impressionism, and he's very, very popular in Boston, or in the US and in Boston. In fact, I have a little quote from an article that appeared in 1891 in the art magazine, The Art Amateur, and it's called The Wave of Impressionism, because it took a while for this Impressionist wave to reach the United States. And as this critic is himself lamenting, like Louis Leroy had done, he says, "One almost wonders if all the pictures of the past are going to be taken out into Copley Square and burned. Titian and Veronese and the old masters have faded. We're told Rembrandt is brown, even Corot is stuffy." And he goes on to say, "Tone, so much prized and labored for in the past, must go." And I harp on that. Tone must go, because that's one of the other factors of landscape painting in the United States. The popularity of Corot led to the rise of kind of an American Barbizon, artists we now refer to as tonalists, who were also painting modern landscapes. And they were among the very first. Here's two examples by Henry Ward Ranger and George Innes, among the very first to try and imbue landscape with something even poetical, with mood, with emotion, to convey an emotion and a feeling through landscape painting. So tonalism, even though I'm not talking about it too much, is one of the other precursors in American landscape painting. As this grew, it continued to open the door wider and wider for the eventual appearance and welcome of American Impressionism. Tonalism is something that many American Impressionist painters actually practice themselves. I'm showing you here William Langston Lathrop from the Brandywine's collection. He goes back and forth between being more of a tonalist, more concerned with the mood and the atmosphere, and being an impressionist, someone who's looking for the effect of light and trying to capture something in the moment. He goes back and forth. And so Lathrop is great to have in this exhibition because he's sort of a bridge to the next style. But as we know, landscape is probably the most portable of paintings, because you take your style to a different place with the different landscape features, and you have a whole new set of subject matters. So I'm showing you here two paintings from the exhibition, Edward Eisenlure and Frank Ray, who both were highly influenced by French painters, who were impressionists in Texas, but who also transformed that style to make sense for their surroundings and their audiences. On the left-hand side, I would not hold it against you if you thought this was a painting in France, because you're looking at those lush, fresh, crisp greens and the haystacks and the distant crop of trees. But in fact, those are the plains of Texas, not Normandy, that's shown. And on the right-hand side, Frank Ray is often talked about as the Rembrandt of the Longhorns. And you get a kind of a disjointed feel. You're like, I know these tones, these pastel colors, the brushwork of Impressionism, but where did the cattle come from? Monet had no cattle like this to paint. So it shows how flexible and portable Impressionism could be, and how useful then in all the different landscape places of the United States. And of course, we have a big, broad country, and someone like Childe Hassam, who is painted in France and trained and studied there, and so well known for his work in New England, could move on out to California, to the West Coast, and he could apply his Impressionist brushwork to the views of Monterey, California. This is Point Lobos and Carmel. And Hassam is great to follow because he's such a traveler. Wherever he went, he made it an Impressionist world there. So the first element of the preconditions was landscape painting and its importance in the United States. The second element I want to talk about is foreign training, how important it was as as a building block for American Impressionism to have foreign training as an artist. And, we're talking about a time period in the late 19th century when it had become de rigueur for artists in training, for students to travel to Europe, particularly to Paris, to attend those schools. It had become the thing to do, partly because of the status and the state of academic art training in the United States. And why not go to those artists and schools that were revered as being among the best in the world? But it's not just Paris, it's Munich and Venice and all sorts of other foreign capitals that our American students traveled to, taking those academic classes wherever they were. And so it seemed very natural that when a foreign style appears on the horizon, that they were properly ready, in position to take on that style because they were already on the scene in those foreign places. I want to take a moment here just to do a side note, because foreign training is one of the reasons why we have such an important group of women artists represented in the exhibition at the Dixon right now. Pay attention to those labels, because I'm not pointing out anything that is shocking to me by saying there are so many women, but I think you will notice there are far more women involved in this movement than you have probably heard of. These names are not going to be familiar, but hopefully they will be soon. Foreign training allowed American women art students advantages that they just did not have in the United States. Even the schools that would admit women only admitted them to a limited amount of classes. And in France, the private academic system, the academies, academy payants that were available would take anybody's money. It's sad to say, but the American women could pay for their training, and it opened doors in France and in Spain and in Germany and in Italy for these women to get the same training that men were getting. So I'm turning here to Edgar Degas, and there is no Edgar Degas in the exhibition. But I like to think of this body of work that Degas did of Mary Cassatt and her sister Lydia, and there's several versions of these works in the Louvre, as really representative of international relations in the art world. So these are a couple of pastels that show Mary Cassatt purportedly in the Louvre looking around with her sister Lydia literally hiding behind a guidebook. And what I want to use these paintings to do, these pastels, is to suggest that Degas is among the French artists who's seeing what American artists are doing, especially after the introduction of Impressionism in France in 1874, the real rollout of it. Here's Mary Cassatt and her sister in the belly of French cultural patrimony, right in the middle of the Louvre. And what are they doing? Lydia is stuck behind a book and she's reading. She's kind of timid. She's not outgoing. She is learning what she's told she should do. Mary Cassatt, on the other hand, I love to think of this as she's regarding the galleries. She is kind of just getting her own bearings. She's making her own opinions. She's taking a look. I like to think she was saying, yeah, I could do that in some ways. So I like to think of these works as parallel to what American artists in France were doing, especially when it comes to Impressionism. They're learning, they're taking their classes, they're studying, but they're also looking around, they're observing as they regard the French cultural scene. And so I want to stick with Mary Cassatt for a moment and go to one of her earlier works. You'll see later Mary Cassatt's in the exhibition, but this is an 1879 painting called On the Balcony during Carnival, which is from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I use this to point out that Mary Cassatt, of course we know, went to France, lived in France, trained in France, in addition to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. But she also traveled further, just like every American student would have traveled further, right? She went to Madrid and she went to Italy and trained. And this is part of the product of her Spanish sojourn. Every artist, not every artist, but so many of the American artists who went to France, we have to remember, also went to the Netherlands, went to Italy, went to Germany. All these other influences of the European world were upon them as well. So I brought this Mary Cassatt in particular, because I think it's an easy one to see the translation or the kind of descent of foreign traditions. When you look at these paintings, you see they have an obvious parallel with the Mary Cassatt, but they also have less obvious parallels with the Mary Cassatt. So they are painting from the very early 19th century and the mid 19th century, the same subject of beautifully dressed women on a balcony observing something going on in the street, whether it's carnival or a parade. The image by Goya from the Metropolitan Museum of Art is very definitely one that influenced Edouard Manet in his version of the balcony. And Cassatt would have been in Spain and seen probably this original Goya, certainly would have known Manet's version of it. And then 10 years later, she produced her version of it. So I'll go back there. So her version of it, you see, she is trained and learns by being in France, but Manet himself learned by going to Spain. So there's this mix of foreign training. It's not just going to one school in France. And I point out this underlying similarity. When you look at who donated the Goya to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it's part of the Havemeyer collection. And Louisine and H.O. Havemeyer, who donated it, were among Mary Cassatt's best friends abroad or at the time period. And Mary Cassatt advised Louisine Havemeyer on many, many paintings to buy. So I don't doubt that Mary Cassatt had a hand in bringing this Goya to the United States through her contacts, the Havemeyers. So with all this foreign training going on, there's a problem, and it's the problem that I think kept American Impressionism out of so many histories of art in the early part of the 20th century. The problem is that later historians and critics of American art felt that, well, in their own words, Louis Mumford said, the study of American artists in France made minor copyists of who had acquired all the tricks of current French art, but had missed its original content, the formative experiences that had made it precisely what it was. We're copyists. To go on, Mumford said, really the only American who went abroad that was able to escape from France unscathed by what he had seen there was Thomas Eakins. So he would have not been happy with John Singer Sargent. This painting is not in the exhibition, but in my mind, there's a William Merritt Chase painting of a stroll in a park that is just so like this. Another American critic, John McCubry, said that all those European diversions were distractions that had to be unlearned later by American artists. So there was not a great love of foreign training often after the period, in the later period of American Impressionists, because it was thought of tainting the artists, of making them foreign, of making them other, making them impersonators. So let me show you an example that comes up a lot. Gustave Caillebott's Paris Street Rainy Day in 1877 and Child Hassam's Rainy Day in Boston of 1885. So if you haven't seen this comparison, you've probably seen one like it with like a Monet haystack and a Theodore Robinson haystack or Theodore Wendell haystack or Theodore Butler haystack. They all painted them. And it makes it an easy visual argument about the lack of originality in American painting. And something I fight every chance I can get in trying to understand and explain that American artists learned by imitation. On the whole, imitation and then taking off in their own direction, which is essentially how the academic system works. You imitate the ancients, you imitate the masters, and then you go on from there. But it worked out poorly for a lot of American Impressionists who were accused of having this derivative style and nothing authentic about them. So I want to bring you back, as we consider foreign training, to another painting by Degas, Visit to the Museum. And now the Cassatt figure, the Mary Cassatt and the Lydia Cassatt figure are both still in the Louvre, and they're regarding something Lydia's looked up from her book. Mary Cassatt, finally you can see that expression on her face, that attitude, the lifted chin of the judgment she's passing on what she's looking at. And I think this is a great metaphor for what's going on in American art. The observations, the evaluations, the contemplations. American artists are thinking, but not yet acting in the 1870s and into the 1880s. They're seeing how this Impressionism stuff plays out and seeing what could be best for them to grow from. The landscape certainly is among those great points of growth for American artists, as they're trying to find, I think of it as their visual voice. What will they say in this new language of Impressionism? So the person, as I've been leading up to, of course, is Claude Monet. That is one of the fine examples of French Impressionists, but probably the one that was most influential on the biggest number of American painters and the biggest number of American collectors. And the relationship between the painters and the collectors is not unimportant, because as an artist in this period, still trying to maintain a reputation, to be professional, to show work and sell work, one had to pay attention to what the market was calling for. So Claude Monet, and I give a nod here to Ross King, who is one of our authors for the catalog, who wrote about this concept of why Monet was so important to American audiences. And if you want to read more, his book Mad Enchantment is about the painting of the water lilies, which really opened my eyes to how a landscape painting, an Impressionist landscape painting, could be so meaningful in terms of World War I. So I recommend those highly. So Monet had his first one-man show in Boston, in the United States, in Boston in 1887. And it was 21 paintings that had been brought together from private collections. So by 1887, there were enough private collectors in Boston and New York with Monets to create an exhibition. That lag time from 1874, when he first started to become known as an Impressionist, to 1887, let the excitement and the buzz about Monet build. And this is where the buzz first started, really, with the famous painting that Monet exhibited at the 1874 exhibition of independent artists who would become known as the Impressionists because of this painting. We all know it, Impression Sunrise of 1872. And this is the painting that I was referring to earlier when I said there's a critic who's writing about this show. And it's a funny article, and he's talking with a friend. The critique is in the form of a dialogue, and they're running around the galleries looking and trying to figure out what Impressionism is. Where are the impressions? Which is this Impressionism? And so the two men are trying to figure this out. And one of them says, as he looks at this painting, impression, I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship, wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. So a tongue-in-cheek critique as well, but this was where Impressionism as a word, as a movement, as a concept that people continued to talk about started. Monet was by far not the only Impressionist. And the great thing about Impressionism is that everybody's work looked different. Everyone had their own signature style. So as an American artist looking at this group of Impressionists, I find it fascinating that so many of them ended up gravitating towards Monet, which is why I asked Ross King to investigate that and tell us why. So here's the man himself in his gardens in Giverny around in 1920. and it's a real color photograph for real. It's not hand colored later. It's just a very early color photograph. And he's in Giverny, which is the important place for Impressionism to the Americans. He had moved there in 1883 out of the city of Paris, and the first Americans began turning up already in 1885, and it became the center of American activity in this impressionist mode. In fact, he was first renting the house, and he was able to purchase it because his paintings were selling so well to the Americans and the Japanese. So he had this love-hate relationship. He certainly was not a friendly, cuddly guy that invited all the Americans over for tea, but he definitely knew that his interactions with the American audiences and American markets were beneficial to him as well. So I'm showing you here a painting that is in the exhibition. It's amazing. It is the 1885 painting by Willard Metcalf called Monet's Formal Garden. And I want to make sure you understand this is not the garden where the water lilies are in Giverny. It's still Monet's property, but it is a kitchen garden that he had tucked down the road a little bit. And when Metcalf turned up in Giverny and had the gall to knock on Monet's door and maybe even got to have dinner with him, we think, he asked if he could paint in Monet's beautiful garden. And he said, nope, but you can go down and paint in the kitchen garden. And landscape historians have confirmed that this is the kitchen garden. It was ordered beds of vegetables, bordered with peonies. So we can even pinpoint the time of year this is painted because of the peonies being in bloom. And you see on the background there a hillside like we're going to see in so many Giverny paintings with a blush of poppies on the hillside as well. So when artists like Metcalf came to Giverny, there was, it's just a little town, a little village, and they stayed at a hotel called the Hotel Baudy. And here's the part of the talk where we look at my vacation pictures. The Hotel Baudy, a photograph I took a couple of years ago, has a marker up outside of it. They have hosted, or according to their guest book, between there were before 1900, there were about 400 Americans registered as guests there. And the plaque outside says between 1887 and 1914, this establishment was where painters and friends of Claude Monet would meet. And they go on to say they honored him with their presence. And this includes, not just Monet, but Cézanne and Renoir, Rodin, Sicily, Mary Cassatt, and the majority of American Impressionist painters who founded a school of painting there. So even the French village recognizes just how many Americans were living there. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing a view out of Monet's gardens and up onto a hillside in Giverny. And as I said, these hillsides, like you saw in the Metcalf, are all over the American painters who went to Giverny as well. So here we have Theodore Robinson and Lila Cabot Perry. And as I said, Monet didn't really welcome all of this attention, but he did befriend a few of the Americans, including these two, who, as so many artists, studied Impressionism by getting to know the work of Claude Monet and what he was doing in Giverny. For instance, this work called Field of Poppies, Giverny, that he had done in 1885. That was the year that Metcalf came to visit. And as we know, Americans were so ready and eager and able to imitate what they saw, to learn from it. It's not surprising that Willard Metcalf painted in 1886 his landscape at Giverny, which are the exact same houses. It is in fact the house of Claude Monet that's shown. On the Monet picture, we have a slightly different angle on the scene. Willard Metcalf on the back of the painting tells us specifically, this is the house of Claude Monet, painted from the end of my garden. So in 1886, he came back and he made sure to rent a house right next door so he could literally watch Monet. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but I am constantly studying this little spot up on the hillside and wondering if these are the shadows of somebody with an easel set up, Mr. Claude Monet. It's nice to imagine it might be. And so I bring you back here with another one of these easy comparisons that we we talked about with the problem of foreign training, so that as artists like Robinson or Butler, both, one of these, the Butler is in the exhibition, are coming to Giverny, they are learning by association, and they're emulating Monet, and they're bringing their reverence for Monet back to the United States. And this is remarkable. There wasn't a circle that formed around Degas. There wasn't a circle that formed around Renoir or Sisley or Pissarro or these others. The Americans really gravitated towards Claude Monet. And so the last concept, the last building block that I want to talk about is sentimentality. And this is a little less straightforward than some of the others. Sentimentality, the way I'm thinking about it, is not about an overly emotional, overly romantic, mushy, even corny representation. To me, that's overly sentimental. I want to think about sentimentality in another way. So many times American artists over the history of American art have been accused of being too sentimental, too saccharine, too sweet, just decorative. And decorative didn't used to be a bad word either in terms of art, but sentimental and decorative were things to be sought after and attained that critics later told us we needed to get rid of in the art world. But a sentimental picture, the way I would like you to think about it as a building block for American Impressionism, is a painting that finds favor with all walks of life. For instance, you don't have to know extensive biblical history, biblical stories, extensive ancient history or histories of modern warfare. You don't have to have an extensive literary knowledge. You don't have to be very well read in Shakespeare or poetry or things like this. It's not a complicated picture, and its symbolism is easily accessed by anyone who looks at it. So in a way, it can still be romantic. It can be nostalgic, it can be patriotic, it can be familiar, but most of all, it's accessible to a big audience. And so I think one of the preconditions for American Impressionism is sentimentality. And it's not only what helped get it started, it's what helped it endure for decades to come. And I wanted to give a different shout out here to Rebecca Bedell's book, Moved to Tears, Rethinking the Sentimental in the United States, as changing my thinking on sentimentality as a bad thing in American art, and understanding that it's a building block, that it's part of the tradition of American art. So two very easily recognizable as sentimental paintings are here, the Daniel Garber and the Elizabeth Norse. And in this sense of sentimentality, we're looking at intimate or personal moments that have been captured. This is something that Impressionism did well as a modern movement. It was not concerned with history. It was concerned with the everyday activities, everyday life. And so we have these moments that are captured. We talk about this all the time in terms of technique, capturing a moment of sunlight on the canvas. But here we're also capturing a moment of human life on a canvas as well. And let me show you another example here by Fanny Eliza Duval and Joseph Kleitsch, two sentimental moments, two personal moments. The Duval, especially if we think it's kind of a nostalgia for childhood, think of your own children, think about your youth. They're about to be confirmed, so there's that religious stirring as well, or the more kind of everyday, taking a moment in the garden of the Joseph Kleitsch. But I want to point out that both of these paintings are set against the backdrop of Spanish colonial architecture. Very common in California to have this occur, because including this architecture kind of was a bit of nostalgia and a bit of regional history. So one could be a little bit sentimental about the ruins of San Juan de Capistrano or other Spanish colonial missions that were in the state. So they're evoking the past, but they're not telling a historical narrative, right? So they're not telling the story about the Spanish missions or the conquistadors or anything, but they kind of are a romantic embrace of the past without acknowledging the true facts of the past, what Spanish colonial life really was like. The same is happening in New England. Willard Metcalf and Childe Hassam, two of my favorite examples here, are participating in this colonial revival that's going on. And it is going on not only in painting, but in architecture and in antiques collecting and in all sorts of other ways, because the colonial revival is a phenomenon that helped Americans deal with, in many ways, Reconstruction, immigration, World War I approaching, industrialization and economic uncertainty, all these horrible and tragic things that are going on in their lives. There's a regression to an easier time, an earlier time, a better time in the past, this fairy tale past, also always ignoring the reality of the past, but embracing the idyllic nostalgia for the past. Even when, as you see here, the Julian Alden Weir, the Childe Hassam, there's a reference to industrialization, as in the Factory Village by Weir, you see it's beautified, it's made pretty, it's made fairy tale, it's covered over by a large looming tree. So you're not really taking in what kind of poverty is in the village, or what kind of pollution is in the village, or what's going on inside that factory. It's made palatable in a way. It's sentimentalized in that way. And the Hassam on the right-hand side is one of my very favorite works that he's done. And he takes both the nostalgia of the past with our New England whitewashed church here, and he combines it with a different aspect of sentimentality, that notion of patriotism. And this could be pride in your local community or in a national level. And you see how he's got this scene taking place at a country fair, and it's bedecked with the buntings and the flags and all sorts of things. If I zoom in, you see lots of the flags and the decorations. And in fact, even that crowd is literally painted in red, white, and blue. Those are little red, white, and blue people all over the scene. It's a massive crowd in front of a church in New England. And he transforms, or he merges in some ways, those colors of the national flag with the people that are in that crowd. So I have one more example to show you, because Hassam is really the master of sentimentality. That painting was, as you see, dated 1890, but he continues and he gets better and sharper at using this sentimentality as a persuasive technique and tool in his painting. So that by the time World War I arrives, he's able to employ his knowledge of using nostalgia, personal moments, patriotism, in order to support the cause of American preparedness for World War I. He did a series of about 30 flag paintings that are like this. The one you see here, Avenue in the Rain, 1917. And you see on the right, even Claude Monet had his very patriotic, sentimental flag moment as well. But Hassam uses it in that lead up to World War I, as the preparedness parades were being marched in New York City. And he's using the painting to kind of allay fears, just like, that Weir did a little bit about industrialization, to unify the country against what is about to be a war like they could never have imagined. No one imagined mustard gas. No one imagined trench warfare. So he's kind of shoring up the American public for what's about to come. And I swapped this painting from another one that the New York Historical Society has, which is a very good example as well. But I swapped it late last week because the painting on the left-hand side, you might have noticed, is from the collection of the White House Historical Association. And that painting was recently put back on view in the Oval Office. So you see it on the left-hand side there in situ in the room, and on the right, more of a detail of it above a bust of Lincoln right by the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. So a painting like this, even though it's not in the exhibition, and I wish it was, but I'm glad it's where it is, shows the fruits of those preconditions of American Impressionism. the importance of a distinctly American landscape, the underpinnings of foreign training, the shining example of Monet, and of course, it's a tour de force of sentimentality, serving all kinds of sentimental needs. Again, not a bad thing. The patriotism, the nostalgia, inspiration, unity, hope. I only wish that this painting could be in the exhibition, but I think it's doing a great service in the space that it's in today. So thank you, everybody, for listening to my ideas about the foundation of American Impressionism. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand it back over to Lindley.
Thank you, Amanda. That was amazing. You have such knowledge, and I know that this has helped us all appreciate the exhibition when we get to see it even more. So thank you very much. So we have a couple of questions, and mine was the first one, and it's pretty subjective, and hopefully I will explain what I mean well. I'm interested, I look at the lovely Impressionist paintings of, of very dapper men and beautiful women walking down the streets or walking through parks. And so I'm very interested in the subject interests of the Impressionists versus now. And if we were to translate the composition of many Impressionist paintings to current day, we would see fashionably dressed contemporary people walking down streets and through parks. And these subjects from the past are interesting to us because we romanticize them and they look very nostalgic. And the same sort of compositions and subjects, to me, I don't think modern viewers would respond to them in the same way, would respond to the same subject matter in the same way. So what do you think that says about subject interests to the Impressionists versus subject interests to us today?
Well, I think the key thing is that for the lag, I'm always a big fan of this time period, this time in between where you get to think about something, where you get to evaluate it. So today we look at the Luxembourg Gardens or the William Merritt Chases and go, oh, look at the fashions, the time, life, and all those. People at the time were also scratching their heads and going, why, especially in Paris, why are they painting just people on the street? That's not significant. Why would you paint such a thing? Those views of the Café Concert, I was like, that's so everyday. Why would you do that? So while we would look at an artist who paints, passersby on the street and say, it's kind of everyday, in decades and a century to come, it's a capsule of life in this moment that we can't possibly appreciate at this time, I don't think. So, there's time to think about it and time for it to become important. So that's why it's important for someone today to be painting that, to be doing that, to give us that window in the future.
So it's kind of the same. People then were kind of like, why are we seeing this? Well, thank you.
Who's worth painting this for? But the American audiences were open-minded at that time. As long as there were no nudes, they were open-minded.
Well, thank you. And then Kevin wanted to sort of add to what you were talking about with sentimentality. There is sentiment in French painting as well, but as far as Impressionism is concerned, does sentimentality become the quality that distinguishes American Impressionism from its French counterpart?
So this is interesting to me because it's only recently that I've been thinking about historical sentimentalism. I work in the world of Andrew Wyeth. I know sentimental paintings of the present moment. And I've been fascinating to know why is his work so popular with people and yet it gets criticized in these ways. So I've been dealing with it in the contemporary sense. And so this is my first look back and saying, it was there before, and it was there a generation before that, and a generation before that. So that would be like the next very interesting thing for me to learn is where else is the sentimentality coming from, right? And I can think of some like Brittany landscapes and things like this that have those qualities as well. And my guess would be it's part of what appeals to an American painter or an American artist is what they see that's familiar and and accessible even when they're in a foreign place. So that would be something that would be great to look into, to know the history of sentimentalism in other countries as well, because there's a history to be done here.
Well, Amy Kurtz Lansing has a good question. Would you make any distinctions between the motivations of American Impressionists of the 1880s and those of the 1920s?
Yes, definitely. I mean, one of the things I look back and when I think about the longevity of American Impressionism, I go, they're still doing it. So I think about Daniel Garber, who literally made a career, not just out of doing Impressionism, but about teaching it as well. And I think maybe there is a difference between the 1880s and the 1920s, because it's fresh and new in the 1880s, and the 1920s, it's installed with some kind of tradition at that point. And not a long-standing revered tradition. I mean, like, you're at the Pennsylvania Academy and your old professor Daniel Garber wants to teach you a style that's already 40 years out of date, right? So there's a maintenance of a tradition with the 1920s artists where it's fresh and new. And I think one of the things that I suggest in the catalog essay is we need to understand better why American Impressionism gets installed, but also what makes it stick around. Like, this is part of the preconditions I didn't poke at so much today. What are the conditions that are going on in America in the teens and the 20s? Like when the Armory show happens in the US, do people turn with an embrace to this American Impressionist style because, oh my gosh, it at least makes sense and it's not crazy and I can understand it, and the abstraction doesn't drive me to up the wall. So I think looking at what else is going on in the society or in the art world really is going to give you a different impression, of what was going on, like with Metcalf in '85 versus Daniel Garber. He's my go-to because it's like 1940 and he's still painting this stuff. It makes it, as I think, very hard to give up a style that had been so right for so long. And there are certainly artists that moved past it and went on to other things. I think about artists like Marsden Hartley, who had a little tiny impressionist moment, or so many other modernists, but then they're the ones that really were devoted to it. And they lived in a time when their work was being put up against, I mean, there were Impressionist paintings American Impressionist paintings in the Armory show. So that's a great comparison. When suddenly this work that was new and daring is lovable and warm and fuzzy and what we want to think about. It's that comforting aspect of American Impressionism that's still at work today. Thanks, Amy.
And our next question is from our curator, Julie Parati. And of course, it comes first with nice greetings. Hi, Amanda. Thank you for this great lecture. And then how did the American artists think of their work in comparison to French Impressionists? Did they think they achieved the same magic they saw in Monet's work? Or was that even a goal?
You know, I think about this with academic artists as well. What was the goal when they went abroad to train? Were they going there to learn the style of the foreign school and to be a member of that foreign school? Or were they going there to get a set of tools that they could bring back and then expand upon in the United States? And so I think with the American Impressionists, it was a set of tools they were building from, because by the 1920s and 30s, what American painters were doing was nothing like what the French painters had done in the 1870s, right? And even Monet it's veering away from. And so I think the American painters, had their own, probably each had their own goals of what they were trying to achieve. But I don't get the sense, reading letters and histories by them, that they were, like the academic artists, oh, if only I could, be as good as my master Jerome and learn to paint with him and I could be in the salon. I don't get that same, there's a lot more independence when it comes to the Impressionist movement. The whole idea being of Impressionism, don't imitate your master, create your own style, create your own voice. So those Impressionist years in training gave them the tools to come back. And especially when I look at the California Impressionists, it's such a different vocabulary that you kind of need a map to be drawn between how did he get from Paris to Laguna, and understand the journey and all the shaping that took place along the way. I mean, like I would have never thought it, but the San Francisco earthquake had a major role in shifting and altering the California Impressionist mindset, because they all kind of had to move out of town and they took up these country places in Monterey instead of being in town in San Francisco. So thanks, Julie.
And our director, our education director, has a good question. She says, her name is Margarita Sandino, and she says hello. And have you had the opportunity to explore Latin American Impressionists?
So I haven't, but in the exhibition, you're going to find the work of Jose Arpa, which is an artist who was really affiliated with San Antonio, a Spanish artist who came to the US via Mexico, where he was working and training. So this is an opportunity, I think, to mention that there is so much work being done right now about global impressionisms, that it's not just about France, as we know. It's also not just about the United States. There are impressionisms that developed all over the world, and each has its own story to tell about their group of artists that went and where they went and who they honored and what their exhibition track was like. And so one of our authors in the book, Emily Burns, is editing a book on global impressionism coming up. And so I've been participating in a few panels with her and hearing about Norwegian Impressionism and Canadian Impressionism and South American Impressionism and Japanese Impressionism. So it's something that we're going to be learning more about as we open up the gateways of Impressionism to be beyond France.
And the last question that I have written down here, that doesn't mean you can't quickly type another one in, is from Kathleen Maracaccio. Hopefully I pronounced that halfway near right. What other museums are slated to host this exhibition?
Easy enough. So in the COVID process, we have changed this so many times, the order of things, but it is right now at the Dixon. And this summer, after it closes at the Dixon, it will go to the San Antonio Museum of Art. So there's a number of Texas Impressionists in the exhibition. They are so well known in Texas, but it's great to put them with California and New England and French. And then it comes to Chadds Ford in October. So it has an East Coast venue as well. I could plug the book too. If you're not near any of those cities, there you go, Kevin has it. The book is, to the best of our abilities, tries to recreate the experience of seeing the exhibition as well. And I'm trying to go to all the venues, so.
Okay, we just had another question pop up from Bill McKelvey. He says, wonderful talk, by the way. And how much of the durability of American Impressionism derives from the less approachability of subsequent styles?
And I think that's part of it. Like I was just saying about the Armory show, in the face of Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, we know that there was a severe reaction to the 1913 show of all that really radical modernism coming from France. And it reminds me of the reviews of the 1886 French Impressionist exhibition in New York. This is shocking and terrible. And what have they done? One of them said, Mary Cassatt, why has she gone astray? So in the next generation, the American Impressionist painting and the French Impressionist painting seemed so much more comfortable, so much more understandable, so much, and the thing is, along the way, we're inching ever further into modernism, because then by the time of, color field painting and abstract expressionism, Duchamp is looking comfortable and modern because you can see his subjects and you can know what he's about. So we're just taking little baby steps, and it's progress. It's progress in being more open-minded and being more accepting of new styles of art. So that ability for the inaccessibility of some of the modern styles and the accessibility of American Impressionism is probably one of those things that kept the style so current into the 1940s.
Kathleen had one more thing to say. Great presentation. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you to the Dixon for this opportunity. For me up in Michigan, it was a terrific follow-up to recently seeing the American Impressionism exhibit from the Huntington at the Fort Wayne Art Museum. Thank you, with many exclamation points. So yes, thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
And everyone that put this together. Thank you, Kevin and Julie.
And please enjoy the show, everybody.
Kevin, would you like to say any words of goodbye?
Well, just thanks so much, Amanda. This was incredible. I'm sure this won't be the last that we see of you on Zoom during the run of the show at the Dixon. And we do have the good fortune of having a longer run than we would have had in the original planning of the show. And so we'll look forward to seeing more of Amanda as this exhibition continues, and then hopefully closer to the end of the run of the show, maybe we'll see Amanda in person, and wouldn't that be fun? So thank you so much for being with us, Amanda. This was terrific. Great presentation, great talk. Congratulations on an outstanding show and a really smart, beautiful book. And come out and see it, folks.
Goodbye.
See you, Amanda.
All right, goodbye, everybody. Thanks for coming.